Our trustee host this evening is Mr. Carl Wallace, who many of you know as a trustee or as the retired president of Lyons Construction Company, but it's especially appropriate that he makes the introduction this evening because, much to my delight at least, he is an honorary member of the British Empire, an honor which he received during World War II. Let me read the citation since I like it. For outstandingly effective work, close cooperation and liaison with the British Army for a period of over 2 years of intense movement of British Army personnel and stores, and of British aid to Russia, oil and supplies, without which the results achieved would have been impossible. Mr. Wallace.
I'm sitting next to Mr. Patterson. He said it's a put-up job, that whole thing. I've got a terrible cold. I just got back from Florida, and I hope you can hear me. Anybody going to Florida this time of the year, they must be crazy because you always catch a cold. I went bass fishing, and it was 90 degrees. And when you go bass fishing, especially with your son-in-law, you find out how you catch bass. You don't use a net. You get the bass fish alongside of the boat, and then you reach down and you put your fist down in its throat and pull up this thing. I never caught a fish that day, I tell you. But as I left Florida, this is the interesting part. The next morning, I was loaded my car and I went out to get in it the next morning and went around to the driver's side, opened the windows. I never got that far. Both of the side windows on that side were completely shattered by gunshot, and there was a hole in my windshield. Now, the windshield is evidently much stronger than the other, and it was just a hole. So we were able to see to drive. We had to get some plexiglass and put over the side because Sundays, that's all that was there. Well, anyway, it was an interesting trip, and I said goodbye to my family, and I hope they don't invite me down again soon. Tonight, in addition to what Dr. Byrd has said, I would like to say one thing. This incident of my experience in World War II, and it had to be two. I'm too young for any earlier war, but I was there with the American troops were sent to expedite supplies up through Iran to the Caspian Sea and into Russia as fast as possible, and it was a well-done job. Not many people know about it, but we did a good job. In doing this, we were in Iran, basically, and the British were in Iraq, and it was my job to coordinate between the two many little problems. There were problems that were easily solved because you just did almost like Colonel North did. You know, you just paid no attention to what the rules and regulations were, but that's how it worked. I used to go to Baghdad, and I had mess with the British. Mess means you ate with them, and that was a very interesting experience too, because they didn't eat the same things that we ate. Their terms of eating are different than ours, and some of the things that I had to get from them were different from ours. One of the things I remember, we were trying to build a spur to the railroad, and we needed railroad ties. Everybody knows what a railroad tie is, big block of wood that you sit down and put the rails on top. Well, I went to this place miles outside on the way to Baghdad to a big British depot, and the commanding officer said, come in, come in. He said, what can I do? And I said, I need some railroad ties. We need to build a spur so that we can unload more ships faster. He said, "My friend, we have no railroad ties." Well, I had just passed acres of them going in. And I thought, all this lend-lease, you know, something's got to be wrong here. I said, well, so I said, "Brigadier, this business is real serious. We have to have them." He said, "We don't have them, my friend." And he said, so I said, "Come here a minute." So we went to the window and I pointed. "That's what I'm talking about. That's what I need." "Oh," he said, "sleepers." Well, that was only the beginning. This thing that Dr. Bird read out is quite embarrassing because, and I'm trying to make up for 40 years. I received this letter from the British Embassy in Washington saying they would like me to come over, and I was kind of down in the dumps about that time of my life, and I refused to go. Well, they sent it to me anyway, and that was a Lord, what's his name?
Inverchapel.
Inverchapel. And I couldn't read his name, so I found out what his name was tonight. But anyway, I'd like to introduce the speaker tonight. And I apologize for my misgivings and for my bad manners in not replying to their kind invitation. Mr. Fall is our speaker. Brian Fall has been Minister, Deputy Chief of Mission at the British Embassy in Washington since 1988. He joined the British Diplomatic Service in 1962. After law studies at Magdalen College, Oxford. He got his BA there, and in the University of Michigan. Mr. Fall has served as Principal Private Secretary to 3 successive Secretaries of State, Lord Carrington, Lord Pym, and Sir Geoffrey Howe. He went with Lord Carrington to NATO in June 1984 to serve as Director of the Secretary General's private office. He returned to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in late 1986, where he was responsible for politico-military affairs as Assistant Undersecretary for Defense. You know what that means. Earlier postings have included 2 assignments in Moscow and 1 as head of the European Front, East European and Soviet Department in the PCO. He served in New York from 1975-76 and was a fellow at Harvard Center for International Affairs in 1976 and 77. Mr. Fall is here with his, pardon me? Mr. Fall is here with his wife and beautiful girl with 3 children, and I now present him to you.
Well, I don't know about the sleepers. I hope that wasn't an omen, but thank you very much for that very warm and generous introduction. The real thing that we British diplomats are always afraid of when we get introduced is to be introduced as the Rolls-Royce of after-dinner speakers. The implication being that the speaker is already evidently well-oiled, scarcely audible, and all too obviously capable of running on forever. I was asked to suggest my own title this evening, and I hit upon East-West relations and new thinking because it seemed to me to point roughly in the right direction. A voice at the other end of the phone made it politely clear that that was not nearly good enough. Did I mean Mr. Gorbachev's new thinking? Or did I mean to imply that a little bit of new thinking on the Western side might not come amiss? Both, I replied, with an entirely spurious impression of decisiveness. Like other monuments to human frailty, it seemed a good idea at the time. The obvious place to start is with Gorbachev's new thinking. if only because it is that which is inspiring much of the feeling that we in the West should be doing something different in response to the considerable ferment that we observe to our east. And there are some in the West, at each end of the political spectrum, who seem to have no difficulty in deciding how we should react to the Gorbachev phenomenon. For some, for example, it has always been axiomatic that the communist leopard will never change his spots. They feel threatened when the wind from the east blows cold, and even more threatened when the sun comes out, because they think that that can only be a trick to induce us to lower our guard. For others, almost the opposite seems true. They blame the West for each upward twist in the spiral of defense spending, and they campaign for the elimination of nuclear weapons and for major reductions in spending on conventional defense. For them, Western defense spending is wrong when Moscow smiles, because it then appears unnecessary, and equally wrong when Moscow scowls, because it may then seem provocative. Now, we may envy such people their certainties without finding either the black or the white entirely convincing. But there's plenty of evidence, and I think not only from Western Europe, to suggest that white is rather quickly becoming the color of the month. And some of the popular reaction to Gorbachev is not only distinctly upbeat, but perhaps somewhat uncritically so. Now that, of course, is not an entirely unprecedented reaction. I am reminded of a rather earlier episode in East-West relations in the mid-1950s, when the Russians, having launched the first space dog and then the first space man, sent Yuri Gagarin on what turned out to be a phenomenally successful tour of Britain. The then Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, was criticized by some for having given the Soviet Union such a wonderful opportunity for propaganda. And his reply to that criticism was vintage Macmillan. He said, "It would have been much worse if they'd sent the dog." Now that is not the whole answer, perhaps, but it's undoubtedly true as far as it goes. And it helped at the time to put the matter in perspective. And some 30 years on, perspective is, I think, no less necessary. I was struck, for example, by some of the exchanges at a transatlantic conference the other day. Someone who was a conservative, not in the party political sense, a conservative with a little c, had set out the case for continuing to observe what have for long been the two main commandments in the NATO Bible. Thou shalt not take shortcuts on defense, as well as the often much more popular, thou shalt not ignore opportunities for constructive diplomacy. Now, the emphasis on defense, and more particularly on the need to modernize where necessary, was brushed aside by a senior academic present as, quote, typical of those who think that nothing has changed, unquote. Now, that, it seems to me, is a dangerous oversimplification of what is a very important argument. Sensible conservatives are not arguing that nothing in the Soviet Union has changed. What it seems to me that they are saying is rather more complex than that, and as it happens, also a little bit harder to knock down. They're saying, first of all, that not everything has changed, and that some of the things that haven't changed are pretty important. Like, for example, subversive activities abroad by the KGB, and the way that the Soviet armed forces, for all the very welcome talk about forthcoming reductions, continue to benefit from major modernization programs in crucial areas of equipment. And secondly, the argument runs, some of the things that have changed could easily change back again if Mr. Gorbachev were to fall under the proverbial bus. To talk at this stage already of the changes of glasnost and perestroika being irreversible seems to me to be at best premature and at worst a rather dangerous example of wishful thinking. You only have to look now at the news and to see the difficulties which Gorbachev has experienced and is continuing to experience as he tries to produce more democratic institutions, and more democratic institutions without an inbuilt and automatic majority of old-fashioned conservatives, in order to realize that it's going to be a bumpy and difficult road ahead. And inevitably, where there is tough sledding, there is a risk, to put it no higher than that, there is a risk of sliding back again. And these uncertainties do not excuse us from trying to work out in our own minds to assess what is likely to happen over the next few years to the Soviet Union in general, or to Mr. Gorbachev in particular. But they are, I think, enough to serve as a warning that we shouldn't put the whole of the family silver on whatever may seem to us to be the best guess today. And they underline also the need for us, if we are prudent, to try to make sure that what we estimate is the most likely on one day is then carefully checked against what experience may bring the next day and the day after. No single snapshot of what is happening in the Soviet Union, however brilliant the photographer and however well chosen his time, is going to provide the complete picture. And this business of estimating and then checking the estimates and then refining the estimates and checking again may sound a little old-fashioned, but is still, I think, the right way to get nearer to the truth. And we've been doing it for some time now, and we have had a few years already of experience against which we can test some of our early hypotheses about Mr. Gorbachev. A lot of questions remain, but I think that there can be little doubt about his energy, his intelligence, and his determination to do something about the problems which make the Soviet Union still a very peculiar sort of superpower. Super enough if you look at its military strength and its wealth of natural resources, and indeed at a large, talented and well-educated population, but in many other ways ill-prepared for the approach of the 21st century. And indeed, for all the rhetoric, inflated rhetoric that one has heard over the years about Great October, scientific socialism, and the road to communism, today's Soviet Union is in many respects as little fitted to lead the nations of the world into the 21st century as its imperial predecessor was to lead the way into the 20th. Now, I don't think that Gorbachev would put it quite like that, but he is the first to admit that very serious problems exist, and in that he's by no means alone. His colleagues on the leadership agree with him that there are problems and that there are serious ones. But the difficulty is in deciding what precisely should be done about them, and that is altogether more contentious. Some in the Soviet leadership, perhaps even many, would rather settle, at least in part, for the status quo. And some of them say that the status quo could much more safely be improved in the rather old-fashioned way, with short haircuts all around and much stricter discipline. Gorbachev is, I think, arguing for something much more radical than that. He's saying, comrades, we've tried kicking the television set. It still doesn't work, and we need a new one. Only the problem is that it isn't only the television set. It's a large part of the Soviet economic system, and perhaps also a large part of the political system. Now, the objective in pressing for these changes, Gorbachev's objective for pressing for these changes, is not to bring about democracy as we understand it in the West. But he does seem to have hoisted in the need for efficiency. Efficiency, not democracy, but efficiency in a way which certainly he realizes is more complex than what it seemed to the Soviet leadership perhaps 20 years ago, when the real problem seemed to be to see how much more steel you could produce and how quickly you were going to catch up with the West on gross measures of rather simple industrial production. What Gorbachev seems to have hoisted in is two important points. Firstly, that in the modern world, economic efficiency needs people who are not afraid to think for themselves. And it also needs people who are able to communicate freely with others. And secondly, he knows that to tackle the formidable problems which he has at home will be easier for him, and perhaps only possible for him, if things can be kept relatively quiet abroad. Now, there is nothing at all new about that last point, which I think was very much in evidence in the way that Brezhnev and Kosygin were approaching things during the détente years of the 1970s. But the first point, the question of needing to think for yourselves and needing to communicate freely as a condition of late 20th century economic development, is the fascinating one, both immediately and in its implications. We have to ask ourselves whether this new thinking, and there undoubtedly is new thinking in Soviet affairs, is going to produce a different kind of a Soviet Union. One perhaps where the man or woman in the street, or at least the man or woman in the university library, the bank or the office, has some first-hand knowledge about the Western world and some degree of influence over the development of political life at home. There are two crucial channels there: the channel between the rulers and the ruled, and the channel between them, the ruled, and the outside world. And it has been characteristic of the Soviet system, at least over its first 7 decades, that both these channels have been blocked. The former, at least in one direction, and the latter in both. Now, if the Soviet Union had happened to be a small country with little or no military capability, these blockages would not have needed to be of any great concern to. But we must also recognize that intentions can be difficult things to judge, especially when you have to take account not only of today's intentions, but of possible changes tomorrow or the day after. Against that background, the statement which one hears so often, that the Soviet people want peace, may well always have been true. And that is an important thing to recognize. But it is equally important to recognize that that statement has been politically almost meaningless, because the two channels have been blocked. And because they are blocked, the Soviet people have not been able to judge for themselves what is happening in the outside world, and therefore what is and is not a threat to the peace. And having made up their minds, if they've been able to, they have not been able effectively to influence the decisions which may be taken in the Kremlin. So in a way, the key question to ask oneself of Mr. Gorbachev is he going to open up those channels? And is he at the same time going to reduce both the quantity and the offensive quality of Soviet military deployments. And if he does, and if those positive changes are given the time that they need to take root and to become institutionalized in the political system, then I think we shall really find ourselves on different and firmer ground. But until then, I feel that we would be wise to accept that the jury is still out. Now, that doesn't mean that we should avoid giving credit where credit is due. It's good, for example, that Soviet troops have left Afghanistan, and it is good that Cuban troops are in the process of leaving Angola. And it is good also that we've been able to negotiate and ratify an INF treaty which meets Western requirements on crucial points. It's a global agreement with effective provisions for verification, and it is one which will cause the side that deployed the most to destroy the most. All that is good, and I see no reason why we shouldn't both think it and say it. But it is true also that if you imagine a hard-headed cost accountant who was concerned, perhaps not for very praiseworthy reasons from our point of view, about the long-term strength of the Soviet Union, he might have had very good reasons to prescribe retrenchment in Afghanistan and in Angola. And it is equally true, I think, that if you look at the INF Treaty, you can explain this as a step towards a very long-established Soviet objective, the denuclearization of Western Europe. And that, as it seems to me, is the rather more complex background against which we now have to consider what it is that we in the West should be doing. Now, I personally have no difficulty with the idea that one hears often that we should be trying to help Mr. Gorbachev, provided that we're very clear-minded about what it is that we should be trying to help him do. But it may be easier still to avoid confusion if we take as our guiding star the rather simpler proposition that we should be trying to help ourselves. And it follows, I think, that the more we personally may believe that Mr. Gorbachev and his closest collaborators are trying to do something sensible in the face of actual and potential opposition from dinosaurs in the Politburo, on the Central Committee, and elsewhere, the more we should be concentrating on helping him to demonstrate that the dinosaurs are wrong. Now, Soviet dinosaurs have been observed in two main groups. Hairy dinosaurs are those who claim that the West is implacably hostile and that the security of the Soviet Union requires a combination of autarky and military superiority. And smooth dinosaurs who claim that the West can be persuaded to disarm unilaterally and to finance the Soviet economy in exchange for nothing more substantial on the Soviet side than fine words and shallow smiles. Both these kinds of dinosaur must, I think, have been appalled by what I believe to be the crucial passage in Gorbachev's speech to the United Nations last year. You may remember that after speaking of the impact on history of what he called two great revolutions, the French Revolution of 1789 and the Russian Revolution of 1917, he went on to conclude, quote, "Today we face a different world for which we must seek a different road to the future." That is revolutionary talk, and it appeared in Pravda, and the dinosaurs don't believe any of it for one moment. They know, just as Mr. Gorbachev knows, that the different road will be hard to find and still harder to follow. But unlike Gorbachev, They want the different road to be seen to fail. So the first rule, perhaps, for Western policymakers should be the eminently sensible one of keeping out of the clutches of the dinosaurs. And that means, first and foremost, not taking shortcuts on defense. It also means acting and being seen to act in a way that helps to debunk the dinosaur myth of a Western threat to the Soviet Union. The more we act in what some argue is a hard-nosed way, the more we try and cut the Soviet Union off, isolate it, frighten it, the more we help the hairy dinosaur argue to his colleagues that he is faced with an implacably hostile outside world that needs to be dealt with the old-fashioned way. And it means also that we should try to conduct government between business, that we should try to conduct business between governments in the way which you and I know from our private lives makes sense when we conduct business between firms. The good deals are the ones from which both sides reliably benefit. And they are struck, I think, by looking first at the intended objectives to make sure that there is a sufficient prospect of agreement at that general level to make it worth entering into detailed negotiation. And then you negotiate, and then you look very carefully, twice, possibly even 3 times, at the small print, and only afterwards do you look at the menu for the celebration dinner. Our immediate task in East-West relations is to see whether we can get the small print right in 3 areas where there now seem to be at least general agreement on objectives: a START agreement, a ban on chemical weapons, and perhaps most important of all, a vigorous attack on the imbalances in conventional weapons that are rightly perceived in Western Europe as a potential threat. Elsewhere, we may need further work on objectives before we can safely get down to negotiating details. Further steps in the reduction of nuclear weapons, for example, would be easier to contemplate if the Soviet Union would abandon its self-serving rhetoric about total elimination and engage the West in a serious dialogue about how much and how little is needed for stability. We don't yet really know what Gorbachev and Shevardnadze are trying to achieve in the Middle East, in Central America, and in Southern Africa. And for all Gorbachev's talk of a common European home, and his, I think, somewhat ambiguous offer of a spare bedroom to the United States, we do not know quite how he sees the road ahead in Europe, and more particularly in Eastern Europe. The Soviet dilemma over the years has been that they have wanted both control over Eastern Europe and an economically and politically viable Eastern Europe. But viability and control have been found often to conflict, and where the conflict has threatened to get out of hand, the Soviet Union has up to now always opted for control. It seems likely that Gorbachev and those around him are even more conscious than were their predecessors of the costs, not least to the Soviet Union, that come from lack of viability in Eastern Europe. And they may also now be ready to recognize that the Soviet Union has, at least to some extent, been a victim of its own propaganda about German revanchism and the threat from the West. So we need to ask whether the bounds of the permissible are really changing. Or is Eastern Europe like one of those grass tennis courts where the lines seem to disappear when the grass is allowed to grow too long, but where a touch of the mower then shows them to be just where they always were? That, I think, is one of the questions to which we have to wait for answers, and let us hope that the answers will be the right ones. And we shall have to ask ourselves always whether Eastern Europe should be a subject that we talk to the Soviets about, as we talk to them, for instance, about Africa and the Middle East. And most difficult of all, we in the West will have to ask ourselves what sort of Europe we would like to see emerge if, as we must all hope, glasnost and perestroika continue to develop in the Soviet Union. Now, of those keenest to see the West do something very different at this stage, some are what I would call dinosaur feeders. There are people who would like to respond to arm cuts that Gorbachev has promised but not yet made, and which, once he has made them, will actually bring us all a little nearer to equality and parity, by making cuts on the Western side, which would at the moment risk moving us further away from parity and equality. And then there are the other people who think that the problems of the Soviet system can be solved merely by throwing money at them. But what the more conceptually minded are hankering after is something more complex than that. It's a new quest for the East-West equivalent of the Holy Grail. A European settlement which fulfills the traditional aspirations of the nations and people of the old continent, but without reviving their equally traditional habit of starting wars. Now, I'm not sure that Western governments have an up-to-date policy about quests for the Holy Grail, so all I can do here is to offer you a few words on a personal basis. You remember the glamorous way of questing, naturally without a thought for Nobel Prizes or even serious money on the lecture circuit. And that is for the Western knight to set off, lonely but determined, towards the east. And somewhere along the way he will meet a lonely Eastern knight deep in the forest, and together they will agree on a way of persuading the Soviet leadership that the security of the Soviet Union can be assured without maintaining an armed encampment in Eastern Europe. Now, if persuasion is all it takes, with perhaps some solemn restatement of the fact that the Western alliance is purely defensive, then who could possibly object? But what if persuasion turns out to involve the negotiation of some sort of a quid pro quo on the Western side? What would it be? Something built on the surely dangerous ground that there is an equivalence between what American troops are doing in Western Europe and what Soviet troops are doing in Eastern Europe? Or on the equally dangerous ground that moving Soviet troops some hundreds of land miles east is as decisive a maneuver as moving American troops some thousands of miles west across the Atlantic? Or are we going to start exploring with the Soviet Union a system which would ensure that liberalization in Eastern Europe would stop short of anyone being allowed to leave the Warsaw Pact to join NATO? And if that strikes you as reasonable enough, then what about an agreement that prevents leaving the Warsaw Pact, period? Or joining the common market instead of Comecon? Or joining the European neutrals in EFTA? And should the regime for East Germany somehow be a stricter one than the regime for, say, Hungary, in order to provide the Soviet Union with the security assurances it needs or will claim to need? Now, some of these detailed questions may sound technical, but they really aren't. Or more accurately, there is nothing technical about the fundamental question which underlies much of that detail. Should we in the West, in exchange for a demonstrable extension of freedom in Eastern Europe, be prepared to join with the Soviet Union in prescribing some limits to that extended freedom, either in Eastern Europe in general or in East Germany in particular? Now, some may argue that half a loaf is better than no bread, but the Western system of values requires that nations, like people, have an equal right to their whole loaf. And if we were to compromise on that point in a negotiation about Eastern Europe, how much do you think that we would turn out to have compromised? And could some sort of a moral ring fence be drawn around it because it's only Eastern Europe? And what if a future Soviet leadership were to renege on the deal that we had so carefully constructed and tighten the screws once more in Eastern Europe? Would the West then be able to respond in some united way, or would we find ourselves in hot water not only in East-West relations, but in West-West relations as well? Now, Lenin is said to have said that one fool can ask more questions in a minute than 12 wise men can answer in an hour. And I've always felt that Lenin was probably right on that particular point, and I'm conscious that I've already asked a lot of questions. The one we started with is, why isn't the West doing something in response to Gorbachev? Why are we leaving the initiative and the headlines to him? Now, the boring answer, but I think perhaps the right one, is that the West isn't doing too badly by being patient. That we can reasonably draw encouragement from the evident fact that it is Mr. Gorbachev who is adjusting to our agenda, and that we should give ourselves time to think carefully about what changes, if any, may be required to the policies that have brought us both peace and increased prosperity over the last 40 years.
Well, we've received not only a well-crafted commentary on Mr. Gorbachev's new thinking, but a sufficient store of questions. So you've done both for us, in a sense. The floor is open for questions until 10 minutes after 7. Yes, Ms. Heller.
Do you foresee a possible dismantling of the Berlin Wall?
The question is, do you foresee a possible dismantling of the Berlin Wall?
I'd very much like to see it. I think we all would, and I don't think that it's inconceivable, because it's become a great symbol. It's cost the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe dear in presentational terms. It is, after all, I suppose, the only wall in the history of human civilization, and the only city wall in the history of civilization built to keep people in. And it would be a tremendous gain for them if they were able to take it down. And it isn't fundamental to the security, certainly not of the Soviet Union. It has no military value. And I don't think that it is fundamental to the security of the East German regime, though they, as you know, are on a very much more conservative route at the moment than is Gorbachev, and it may be something that will have to wait for life after Hanukkah.
Yes, ma'am.
Interested in your comment on the large demonstration yesterday, pro-Yeltsin demonstration.
Would you comment on Mr. Yeltsin's support?
I have always thought that Gorbachev lost considerably when he lost Yeltsin as a colleague on the Politburo, because when Yeltsin was still around, Gorbachev, if you like, had a snowplow out in front of him, and a lot of the sort of dirty, cold, and messy work was being done by somebody else who was the primary target. Now that Yeltsin has left the train, so to speak, Gorbachev has had to be his own snowplow, because he's the only, he's far ahead of any other major politicians. You have to go down into the academies to find people who are outthinking him or thinking further forward than he's making speeches. So he's lost by that, but at the same time, Yeltsin is thoroughly difficult for him to have to handle in this election. Gorbachev, I mean, the Russian people have got very little experience of elections of any sort of a proper kind, and what Gorbachev wants is to have democratic-looking elections that end up with a comfortable majority that is not stick-in-the-mud conservative, and not too Yeltsin-like and adventurous. And it isn't easy to do. Western politicians have been trying for 300 years, and if they'd got the formula, they'd have been using it. So I think that Yeltsin is causing trouble at the moment, is provoking probably more anxiety among the conservatives, a greater feeling among conservatives that this whole business is getting out of hand and ought to be stopped, than Gorbachev, who doesn't want to stop it, finds comfortable. But I think what he must do is try to let demonstrations happen and move through and avoid the crushing defeat, really, of ballot rigging to prevent Yeltsin getting elected. He'll be one among many, and I think he's probably capable of doing a lot more harm outside than inside. It's very much a sort of Lyndon Johnson assessment, I think.
Could you comment on what role the United Nations, either in its present form or slightly modified, might play in East-West relations?
Would you comment on the potential role for the UN in East-West relations?
I think that the UN can reflect better East-West relations, which it's already doing if you really the evidence of the last 6 months in a change of attitude on the part of the Reagan administration towards the end. Congress is now a little bit more generous with the money. The UN is regarded as having done a number of good things and continues to do so, Iran, Iraq, Namibia. And in that climate has been helped by the fact that the 5 permanent members of the Security Council have been able to work together as they did over Iran and Iraq. And that is entirely to the good, and it means that it helps defuse regional conflict as a danger for East-West relations. You can use the United Nations to show that you believe that what is happening right and wrong in Southern Africa is much more explainable in African terms than in East-West terms. So in that sense, it's very constructive, and doing more of it will be better for East-West relations. But I don't really think that the UN will ever be brought in to help decide how far the Hungarians are allowed to go, for instance. I think that on these absolutely fundamental issues of security, where one or other of the old-fashioned alliances believes its fundamental interests to be at stake, I don't think that for this decade we will find the United Nations being turned to very readily by either side. I may be over-pessimistic, and things have been moving very fast over the last 3 or 4 years, and I would like to be surprised, but I think that one, I see much more of a role north-south and regional than I do on those mainline NATO Warsaw Pact type security issues.
Sir, I believe you're next, and then Dr. Haji.
You touched on it just briefly, but how do you think the Chinese feed the dinosaur? Put another way, what is the impact of China on the 2 East-West relations that we've talked about here?
I don't know yet how far that's going to go. It's clever, both for the Russians and the Chinese, because life was really far too simple for the Americans and for their allies for a long time, with this business of 2 neighbors not talking to each other. But it's not surprising, because the fundamental reason that the Chinese did not get on with the Soviet Union was that the Soviet Union was claiming not only to be country but church. The Pope was in Moscow, there was only one Pope, and you could deal with the Soviet Union on a party-to-party basis only by accepting the infallibility of the Politburo on matters of doctrine, to put a slightly crude analogy. Now, the Chinese, for national reasons and lots of other reasons, were not going to have that. And that threat has disappeared. There aren't sort of every 3 years great conferences of communist and workers' parties of the world designed to excommunicate the difficult or to make everybody toe the line. Moscow doesn't think of itself like that anymore, or if they do in their heart of hearts, they know that they'd be very foolish to try it on for the next 10 years or so. So China is able to relax as far as party links is concerned. This is another communist country. They're doing some things, we're doing other things. They come and look at how we run our agriculture. It's all much more even and much more relaxed. And then you get back to asking yourself, why aren't we trading across this very large border between us? Why don't we talk about troop deployments? And the answers to those questions are, let us talk more. So we're in a very much more natural state-to-state phase now, rather than a communist-to-communist phase now. But there are two states which remain very difficult to penetrate from the outside, and one will never know quite how quickly it's going to change. And I think that there's a great capacity for surprises in that relationship, not all of which we may find comfortable.
Yes, sir.
At first I was wondering whether Mr. Paul could express the views of British government Department of Foreign Affairs, since the main body of your delivery subject this evening was on Gorbachev. What are the views of the State Department and Department of Foreign Affairs in Great Britain with regard to the long effect of Gorbachev, what appears to be temporary charm, on the Western European in terms of policy making, which inevitably in the future with the cooperation of the United States will determine the future of the free world? Is it something temporary which may fade away, or is it something that may ultimately affect the mind of the policymakers in Western Europe? I was wondering what the British Department of Foreign Affairs feel about that.
I think the question is, what is the British view of the impact of Gorbachev's approach upon the thinking and implicitly the cooperation of European leaders?
I think that he presents more opportunity than danger, because what he is really doing is accepting to talk on the basis of our agenda and to do a number of things that we have always said needed to be done. And I think that it would be crazy to get ourselves so worried about the charm offensive that we weren't able to sit down and talk and sign a good agreement where there's a good agreement to be signed. But I think that you're right that at the same time it produces problems. There's a very topical one now on this new follow-on to the Lance missile, which NATO probably ought to be deciding to do something about fairly quickly, because if you don't start developing it now, you won't have it when you need it in 5 or 6 or 7, however many years' time it is. That is going to be an enormously difficult decision to take politically, and the political difficulty is caused very largely by the perceptions of reduced threat, which Gorbachev, it's been one of the effects of Gorbachev. I think, and I have thought really for a long time, that we have been our own worst enemies on the Western side on arguing for defense spending so much on a basis of threat, so that when people are talking to each other, you say, well, where's the threat? He's a perfectly nice man, just had lunch with the Prime Minister, what more could you expect? But this is a misleading way of looking at it. Defense spending is equally and perhaps better explained as an insurance policy. You don't stop insuring your house against fire or theft because it hasn't burned down or been burgled over the last 10 years. You go quietly on. You can argue about what size of premium is sensible, but I don't think anybody here would argue that you just forget about it. And it's that sort of attitude which I think we have to have towards Gorbachev. Nothing that we are doing in the military side is going to cause him to stop coming forward towards the West. He knows what he wants to do. He doesn't privately think that we're threatening. I think there's been a great mind change there, him and perhaps his generation. They don't believe all the old stories about NATO being about to invade, and that's why we can do business. And we will do business more effectively if at the same time we can maintain a a reasonable level of defense and not sort of suddenly decide that that's all what we did for, for the last 40 years, and that for the next 40 years we needn't bother. In a way, I think that we're in as good position as we are now today because of the efforts that have been made over the defense side over the years, and we just need to have the self-confidence to continue them and to do the smiling with Gorbachev. There's no reason why we should scowl.
We'll have to make this our last question. Dr. Condon.
I'd be interested in your assessment of the role of the Muslim population within the Soviet Union, especially in the potential for creating problems given the rise of fundamentalism in the region and maybe some of the other troubles with Armenians.
The role of fundamentalism in the Muslim population of the Soviet Union, I think it's something that the Russians, using the word advisedly, are worried about, partly because they don't understand it any better than we do, and perhaps slightly worse. I don't think that it's in the Muslim areas of the Soviet Union that it's not top of the crisis list as far as Gorbachev is concerned at the moment, because these are relatively backward parts of the Soviet Union with their nationalities deliberately and artificially split up between republics precisely to make them more tractable. And that on the whole I think has worked not too badly. And that with many, many, many years of very little religious observance beyond the formal, has not, I think, made it, I don't think it's a flashpoint. If I were Gorbachev, I'd be much more worried about the Baltic republics, and particularly about the Ukraine, which is 6 times bigger than the Baltic republics put together, has all the same suppressed nationalism there, has its folk memories of links to the West, and would be a very, very much more dangerous and difficult problem to handle, I think, which is why that sort of nice old-fashioned man continues to be used by Gorbachev to keep the Ukraine very much in the old thinking sort of way. It'd be interesting to see who replaces him when he finally topples.
To all of you who still have questions, we apologize, and we certainly do thank our guest for what was substantively an instructive evening and for an evening full of good sense. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.